of the most common comments I hear from students at the Airbrush Getaway is that their airbrush is clogging. And actually it will seem to be that way when using the airbrush, but really it's not actually clogging. It's usually one of a few other problems. I'll go through some of the things that could be going on when your airbrush seems to be experiencing a problem. It doesn't flow well and you'll think it's clogging, but here's what you can do to find out. The two most common culprits when working on your airbrush or trying to deal with what may seem to be a clog are tip dry and a clogged air hole. So let's talk about the air hole first. The air hole will be located on either the bottle or the cap of any airbrush that you use. On a bottom feed airbrush, for example, it's right here. You can see just underneath the airbrush there's this tiny hole that goes through, and I usually keep an old needle around so that I can pass it through the hole, making sure that that stays nice and open. If paint clogs this hole, then air cannot go in to replace the volume of paint that comes out. Therefore, it creates a vacuum in your bottle, and that's why the airbrush seems to be clogged. It's not really clogged, it's just not able to pull the paint out of a vacuum that's in the bottle. So it can't come out the end of the airbrush, and it starts to sputter or be unpredictable. So first thing you want to look for is a clogged air hole. Now, the top feed airbrush has an air hole as well. So in the very lid of the cap here on the bowl, there's a small little hole. Make sure that stays nice and clear. Now, moving on. The other really bad thing with airbrushing is a thing called tip dry. Now, you're really going to run into this with water-based paints way more than you will with an enamel. Like if you're using Sign Painter's One Shot, it doesn't happen that often. With urethanes, it happens, but also not as often. When you go into the water-based world, then you're going to get it literally about every 3 to 5 minutes, if not faster. Because the paint dries so fast that it dries right on the needle here on the end of the airbrush. So therefore, if you'll notice this other brush, it's got a little piece on the end here that's still on. This is here, it's a piece that's called a tip guard, and it protects your needle. It's a needle guard or a tip guard, depending on the manufacturer that you buy it from. But suffice just to say, this is here to make sure that you don't damage your needle. So when you're first learning, you leave this piece on so that if you drop your airbrush, you don't damage the needle or the tip. A more advanced artist, you'll find almost everybody that's a pro takes these things off and paints with a bare needle. Now, the reason we do this is because we can keep a really close eye on the condition of our needle to see if tip dry is accumulating on the needle. The moment paint starts to dry on the needle, it disrupts the airflow around the needle and starts causing the airbrush to be unpredictable. So if ever you start to spray something, make a dot, make a line, and the airbrush hesitates, you better look quickly at the front end because you may have tip dry starting to happen. It should always be very predictable when you're airbrushing. So clean that paint off the end. You'll find some people who are absolute Nazis about not touching the needle. I'm not that way. I think you can get in there and touch it, but you do want to be careful and not bend or damage that needle. So touch it carefully, but keep that needle nice and clean, and you'll have much better flow of your paint. This is an example of what it may look like when tip dry happens to you. Usually it's an opaque color like white or black or any color that's very strong that would defeat or cover another color is known as an opaque. So transparent colors are much more desirable to prevent this, but sometimes you just need an opaque color. So opaque white, I've sprayed a little bit of white for a moment here and there's paint dried on the needle. And this is what it looks like. If you look really close, you compare the clean needle in my hand to the one that's in the airbrush, and you can see one has white paint dried on it and the other doesn't. So to eliminate this condition, I just come in with my fingernails and I just pick at it just a little bit. And this becomes a habit. You'll find, if say you're at my shop talking to me, and if I have an airbrush in my hand, I'm probably constantly picking at the needle while we're talking. It just becomes a habit because you always want to stay on top of this tip dry situation. So that's all it would take. Now, there is another way to do it. It's a little more kind to the airbrush or to the needle. You could use, for example, a Q-tip. With a Q-tip, I recommend using a hollow-stemmed Q-tip, something that's got a plastic stem, and then you can dampen that with a little bit of solvent or water, depending on your type of paint, and just press it over the needle, give it a little twist, and that'll keep it nice and clean as well. All right, while we're on the subject of paint, let's talk a little bit about the different types of paint you might be using, because paint could actually be part of the problem. You know, if the paint's too thick for the given amount of air pressure that you're spraying at, it's quite possible that the airbrush cannot force it out the end of the airbrush properly. It won't atomize. So if your pressure is too low, then you either have to thin your paint or you have to increase your pressure. Now, the average artist will use between 30 and 50 psi, kind of an average. So 40 being kind of the sweet spot for most types of painting. And a lot of artists that are doing real detail work, they're going to cut that paint even lower, 30 psi and below. A guy like me who makes a living painting t-shirts, I'm going to paint somewhere around 60 or 80 psi. So psi means pounds per square inch for those of you who are new to airbrushing. So that's just a setting, and it just needs to feel right. When it's spraying right, you'll know it. When the airbrush is flowing correctly, you'll know it. But one way of checking to make sure that the airbrush is not the problem and to be able to blame it on something else is to do what I call a solvent test. The reason I say a solvent test, solvent means whatever you need to reduce your paint to a thinner paint. For example, say you're using urethanes, you're going to need a urethane reducer to reduce that paint. If you're using lacquer, you're going to use lacquer reducer. If you're using water-based paint, obviously you're going to use water. In this case, I am using water-based paint, so I've got a little bit of water in this bottle. So when you press down the airbrush at first, the only thing you're going to get is air, right? Nothing should come out at all. So that's another check. If you're seeing anything come out at all when you press the button down, then you got a problem. So if it looks like that as soon as you press it down, that's an issue, all right? The way you solve that issue is it's usually a clog in the very front of your airbrush, like a piece of dry paint that's in the nozzle. It's a very simple fix. You undo the back side of the airbrush, you take what's called the handle off of it. You loosen up this little nut, you pull the needle back. You can take it all the way out if you'd like and clean the tip with a rag or with your finger. Place it back through the airbrush. And when you seat it, you should feel metal-to-metal contact. If it feels squishy at all, that means there's still something clogged in the front of your airbrush. It's dry paint. So I would depress the trigger and work the needle back and forth until it feels good, like a nice metal-to-metal, confident feeling contact. All right? So you'll tighten your needle back up, and then after that, when you press this down, you should have no more trailing, no more paint just flowing automatically off the end. So if that is not your problem, then, and you know that the air hole's not the problem, and neither is tip dry because you've tried those first. Those are the two #1 problems. Then what we're going to do is we're going to press down, roll the trigger back, and you'll start seeing paint come off the end of the needle. It should come smoothly and beautifully off the end of the needle. And as you roll the trigger farther back, it should still flow smoothly off the end of the needle. No skipping, no spitting, no sputtering at all. This is how an airbrush that's working properly should look. If you can get this going on, there's not a problem with your airbrush. Now you know you can blame it on your paint or somewhere along the lines. Maybe the dip tube has a clog in it, or like say again, back to the air hole, or maybe the thickness of your paint. So that's how you isolate what's going on with your situation here and do the troubleshooting. You put that solvent through there and you give it a good spray. Now let's talk a little bit about the shape of this pattern. At wide open, looking real close, notice that there's a lot of paint coming out, but it's a very small stream. And way out toward the end, look how much softer and rounder and larger the pattern is. That should be a clue to you that when learning to airbrush, if you're ever going to do fine detail work, you're going to have to get in real close on this pattern toward the very front. If you want to do soft, beautiful blends and shading, you're going to have to be farther and farther away from your surface. And that's how you get beautiful blends, is using distance to help you, along with what the airbrush just does naturally. I hope these tips will help you in the middle of the night when you're having a deadline and you're trying to really kind of get something finished, but you got a clog in your airbrush, or you think it's a clog. You'll now know how to isolate it and find out what it really is. Good luck with your airbrushing. Come see us at an Airbrush Getaway for live, hands-on instruction from some of the world's best instructors.